So it's happening. Trump versus the BBC.
I'm suing the BBC for putting words in my mouth. Literally, they put words in my mouth. They had me saying things that I never said.
The president wants a tidy $10 billion. Is that all? In damages over the now infamous Panorama edit. The BBC apologised for its mistake, but says it has no legal case to answer and will defend itself. So how will it play out?
Donald Trump is going to struggle to prove that his future financial prospects have been damaged by this.
And why Robert and I both predict Starmer will still be Prime Minister this time next year.
Shabana Mahmood, Wes Streeting, possibly Ed Miliband, Andy Burnham, Angela Rayner. Do I think any of them yet has anything that looks like an overwhelmingly compelling programme to restore pride in our nation? No, I don't.
Watch us eat our hats. Hello and welcome to Talking Politics, our last show of the year. Indeed, I'm Tom Bradby.
And I'm Robert Peston.
So many things to talk about, but let's talk about Trump and the BBC. A million things we could say. We should also talk about the potential future of the BBC, which has been in the news this week. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing with Trump at the end of the day, I don't know whether you agree, is pretty simple. There's absolutely no way the BBC can pay out to Trump without going to court. I mean, that would be... The BBC's been making some strange decisions at late, so let's not rule it out. And I can see the logic of it might be, well, listen, we pay him 10 million, he gets his victory, we admit defeat, and it costs us less than it might do to go to court when you're going to be eligible for at least some of the costs. I can see that logic, but I just think that the idea that the BBC pays out on a lawsuit that pretty much every lawyer I've spoken to considers, specious at best, with virtually no chance of succeeding. I think for the BBC to do that would be so toxic. I'm not actually sure their reputation would recover, but maybe you don't agree.
Look, their legal advice. I mean, when we were still waiting for the, BBC to decide what kind of response to make to the Trump threats, I said actually on News at 10 to You that the BBC had unambiguous legal advice that there was broadly no serious damages inflicted on Trump. There was no serious case to answer. Yes, there was a breach of their own editorial standards. There was a breach of the impartiality rules set by Ofcom. But that is a world away from a broadcast that caused material damage to Donald Trump. I mean, I have to say, his lawyers definitely have a sense of humour, because I'm going to read an extract from the court documents that they filed on his behalf, and it said that the Panorama editing had, and this is direct quote, caused massive economic damage to his brand value and significant damage, this is my favourite bit, significant damage and injury to his future financial prospects. I mean, I think we all wish in our roles. The idea that, anyway, it's sort of laughable. There is, however, always a risk, when you fight these things, the legal bills mount up and up and up and up and up. And I don't know whether the BBC can be confident that if it wins, it won't nonetheless end up with a pretty enormous legal bill. And so I guess the calculation, for you to be right that they're way better off fighting than settling, you sort of have to be confident that in the end there isn't going to be some absolutely ginormous legal bill greater than whatever it is they would offer for the whole thing to go away. I mean, their judgment, to be honest, hasn't exactly been brilliant on this whole affair from the word go. I mean, it was a sort of unbelievably stupid bit of editing by Panorama. And even if you take my view that it hasn't massively damaged Trump, it was still terrible for the BBC's reputation for accurate reporting and impartiality, and not basically apologising for it as soon as it. I mean, I think that frankly, a decent organisation and I hope we're a decent organisation. I think, when we, I hope I'm right in this, that if we'd been in a similar position, we would have taken it down immediately and made a rapid apology. And it's a really, at the time when Prescott makes submits his dossier, surely that's one moment when they could have sorted it. The moment that it's in the Telegraph, the fact that it just drags on repeatedly, it just feels. It just doesn't. It feels. That's my problem with the BBC.
Regular listeners to this podcast will know that we've discussed elements of this before, and I don't want to repeat the same thing. Sure. But there's one thing that I think is worth mentioning, which is that, this business of splicing together two sound bites, for want of a better word, has become a sort of, like, everyone has quoted that as if it's the most horrendous thing that's ever happened in television. And the truth is, we've just done that millions of times in our history. You're doing the leader's speech to Tory or Labour Party conference. You might white flash it, you might put a bit of commentary between two bits of sound, but it's not unheard of to take two bits of sound and bolt them together. And the crucial thing is, are you altering the sense of what that person says?
That's always the judgment that any of us make.
That's always the judgment that any of us make. And in this case, I think what the BBC, if I haven't spoken to the programme makers or the people who are in the edit suite, I imagine what they would say is, look, the end impression that we ended up giving was not incorrect, because if you look at what Trump said across the course of that week in general, this is a reasonable summary of that. However, it's also unarguable that it was taking two very different bits of the speech and bolting them together without all the context in the middle. So I think Trump is unquestionably right. And then people might say, well, okay, Tom, if you're conceding that, and this was a mistake from the BBC, why shouldn't they pay out for damages to his reputation? And
because of the wider point, because the two things can be seemingly contradictory things can be true, right? It can both be the case that there's been a breach of editorial standards and Trump was not in the process damaged, because the wider point that Panorama you say have made in their defence, which is, if you look at his comments over the course of hours and days, the way that they bolted those two things together may well, have been an accurate summation of sort of what he felt and thought, right? May have been, right? But I think it was still not what he said, and therefore, therefore, for that reason, right? The thing that he got wrong was not taking it down and apologising unbelievably fast. But nonetheless, and we've all been in sort of semi-comparable positions where we know we've made a mistake. And as I say, I hope most of us, certainly I genuinely tried throughout my career, if I know I've made a mistake, to sort of basically apologise as fast as possible, because I just think that's the only way to preserve your reputation, right? But equally, sometimes you just make a mistake and, there's not sort of material harm done, even though it's an incredibly embarrassing mistake. And I think that's sort of what this is, which is, in the end, I may be wrong, but I do think that Donald Trump is going to struggle to prove that his future financial prospects have been damaged by this.
I mean, listen, the point is, what Trump's people would, I'm sure, do argue, is that the way the speech was edited looks like he was, trying to fire people up to storm the Capitol building. And that, he obviously, when you listen to the whole speech, there's a different context out of it, and that isn't the case. However, we know that Donald Trump was trying to overturn the election, the call to the election officials in Georgia, everything he did with Mike Pence to try and stop the election being certified. And we know all that. So I think the idea that
he's also pardoned some of these people who are, committing crimes. So, I mean...
But that, I think in the end, that's why the BBC can't pay out, because I don't think I would imagine most people in Britain who are a bit jaundiced with Donald Trump now, even if they agree with him politically, and there's lots of things that many people here you talk to quite understandably, think Trump is doing right about controlling immigration or whatever. And so, there are lots of reasons people like Donald Trump. But I think as a man, and certainly in terms of his attitude to democratic norms, the vast majority of people here are pretty jaundiced by that. So to see the BBC pay out would be very problematic. But let's move on to talk about, obviously, the BBC's future was in the news this week. And every time this comes up, I find myself sort of reading into it and then thinking, you know what, they'll do all this and then they'll opt for the status quo. But maybe they, as in you look at advertising models, that's problematic for us, as I know you're about to talk about.
Yeah.
You look at subscription models, that's problematic. And I just think in the end we'll end up back where we started. But maybe you don't agree.
I mean, I genuinely can't be certain about this. I personally just think that simply floating, as Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, did in their consultation document on the future funding of the BBC, simply floating that two options. One, just advertising everywhere on the BBC versus a narrower version with advertising restricted to certain BBC platforms. I think both of those are sort of, people will know, I'm going to say I've got a vested interest here, right? I'm not impartial, right? But I think both of them are unbelievably bad as ideas for the kind of healthy, impartial news ecosystem, to use that awful cliche, that I assume this government wants. And what do I mean by that? It's because there is no bottomless purse when it comes to advertising, right? There's a bunch of businesses and institutions that want to use television to advertise. And truthfully, if the BBC is allowed to have a chunk of that advertising money, there will be less for Channel 4, there will be less for Sky, and there'll be less for us. And none of us are exactly making gazillions of, dollars at the moment. We are all, compared to the digital giants, I think we do an incredible job of producing not only, decent entertainment and culture, but amazingly important impartial news. And I just think, why would you moot a model that could do really serious damage to other serious news providers?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the whole idea, when I read it, I just thought, well, that's completely insane. Why would you suggest that? The whole thing just seems like comically unlikely as well.
Well, I hope it's unlikely, but you just, why would you? If it's supposed to be a serious document, why would you just, I think it should be ruled out a priori, but the fact that they're not even doing that is mad.
For those who haven't joined all the dots, we should point out, like ITV and indeed Channel 4 are organisations entirely funded by advertising. Not quite true. There's a subscription tier on ITVX, but primarily funded by advertising and always have been. We're already, and you can like us or not like us, but I think almost everyone thinks that having big, impartial broadcast news providers that aren't the BBC is a good thing. I don't think anyone, even in the BBC, thinks that's a bad thing. And, we're already up against Google and Meta and all these other people, and have been for some time. We've also got the streamers who, by the way, don't do any what you might call public, they do lots of great entertainment, but they don't do any what we used to perhaps think of as public good or public service. They don't do news, they don't do many documentaries, they don't do much current affairs. Really, it's still ITV, the BBC, Channel 4 and Sky. So, the idea that you'd mess about with that and put us under even more pressure when we don't need to, and I don't think anyone in the BBC even wants that, I just think that's a kind of weird suggestion. And, it falls into and I don't think it'll go anywhere. I bet a lot of money it'll never happen. At the most, it'll be a tiny tier. And you just think, it's just another example of this sort of weird political judgment. And, by the way, another thing, the newspapers all hate it because they're already under pressure about advertising as well. And they're already, angry enough about the BBC and its website and all the things they say, put it into competition. So, I don't know, weird decision. We probably should move on and talk about politics in 2026. And
we should. Finally, on as it happens, I think there is a world in which the BBC is allowed to charge subscriptions for some of... Yeah. I don't think that's a crazy idea, right? And I don't think that would shrink, in a sense, the available cake for the rest of us. I think so. That seems to me, maybe, cut the license fee, give them more scope to do, subscription services. I think that's sort of rational, but advertising, nuts.
Okay, let's look forward to 2026, our last show of the year. It's been an incredible year, and we could reflect on all of that, but we have done a lot of that during the course of the year. I'm going to kick off, and I'm pretty sure we won't be on the same page about this, but I would bet this is where everyone can enjoy me eating my hat on this table in a year's time. But I think Starmer will survive fine till the end of next year. And I've been thinking about it a lot. And, we've talked before about the various coup attempts under Gordon Brown, the endless speculation during his last year in office that he was going to be booted out as leader. I just think you can talk about it till you're blue in the face, but actually doing it is a big thing. I'm just reasonably confident that the average voter in your average constituency just doesn't want another leader, let alone a general election or anything else. So I feel like unless they really, really mess it up, Starmer is going to make it to the end of next year, and he's just got to get better about politics. And if he does, maybe he'll be in a better place. And there's a lot we can talk about reform and the Tories. I've been having various chats with Tories this week, which were quite interesting. But what's your start point for 2026?
Well, I mean, look, I've got to sort of comment on your view about Starmer. And no, I mean, and actually this is going to surprise you. I agree with you. I think Starmer will still be Prime Minister at the end of the year, unless, one of two things happen. One is he commits another sort of catastrophic political misjudgment, and there have been some pretty serious misjudgments he's made since he became Prime Minister, or the Scottish, Welsh, and local elections are so bad for Labour that MPs just can't see, on the basis of his leadership, any path back where enough of them save their seats. Because the biggest sort of structural weakness that he has in terms of his own, security of employment is that there are something like, it's 100. It's a bit more than 100 Labour MPs have majorities of less than 10%, right? And it means that a swing against Labour of, 5%, right, means they're out of a job which most of them assumed, given what was a parliamentary landslide, it was a job they thought they'd have for 10 years, and they'll be out of a job in 3 years from now, right? And that's scary for them. And you have to remember that in order to sort of trigger a leadership election, 81 of them have to basically call 81 have to sign a letter of no confidence in him, right? And so that's fewer than people in pretty marginal seats. And the swing in the polls at the moment against Labour is, it's way more than 5%. It's like 7, 8, 9%, and depending on which ones you look at. Okay, this is nerve-wracking for him. On the other hand, right, and this is on the other hand, right. The reason I think he will still be there, and, best one in the world, he has singularly failed to give British, this is not a judgment on whether this or that policy is a decent policy in itself, or this or that initiative in the foreign relations sphere is good or bad. The thing that he just cannot do is give the British people a sense of where he's taking the country and give them, restore hope, because, there's been a massive erosion of hope, both for the future of the country, but more significantly, vast numbers of people have lost confidence that their lives are going to get better. And he just has not got that ability to provide not only a coherent program of measures, but then explain how they all fit together so that, we can as a nation be more optimistic, right? Now, that is a weakness, but then I just say to myself, right, okay, who are the candidates? Well, it's obviously Shabana Mahmood, Wes Streeting, possibly Ed Miliband. It's unlikely. Some people think he would be a candidate. He's certainly very popular with members. Andy Burnham, Angela Rayner, right, all definitely better communicators than Keir Starmer. Okay, they're all better communicators than Keir Starmer.
Agreed.
Right? But do I think any of them yet has anything that looks like an overwhelmingly compelling program to restore pride in our nation? No, I don't. Now, it's possible that, they will become, sort of the equivalent of, Michael Young, who wrote the 1945 Labour Manifesto, which transformed Britain, or Blair in the run-up to the 97 election, or Thatcher, actually more in her first term than in the run-up to 79. Now, it's possible that one of them will suddenly emerge with that kind of political genius, but I don't see it at the moment, and therefore if you are a Labour MP, the thing you've got to ask yourself, and this is why in the end I think he'll still be leader, is if we get rid of him, the British public are going to think we are just as chaotic as the Tories. And we saw what happened to the Tories when they replaced their leaders, right? At the end of the day, they're lucky not to be extinct, and they may yet be extinct, and we might come on to that. But Labour does not want to be in that boat of being seen by electors as basically being a totally dysfunctional institution, and therefore that's why I think in the end they probably will stick with him. But I may be wrong.
By the way, I think you're completely right about the general public thinking, you're going to change your leader. You've got to be joking. I mean, again, what? And I think the fact that so many Labour MPs can't see that tells you everything you need to know about the sort of myopia in politics more generally. But I wanted to sort of move on to, I was kind of playing a kind of, game in my own head, like imagining things that will never happen in a month of Sundays. But should Keir Starmer invite Robert Peston and Tom Bradby in to give him advice about what he needs to achieve in 2026 to put him in a better, stronger position by the end of the year? I thought that was a good kind of strategy game to play in your head. And I thought critical figure for me next year is Shabana Mahmood, because if by the end of the year she can make significant inroads in convincing people that on the small boats crisis and on immigration more generally, she is taking tough measures, and it's a whole separate debate about what that will entail and how far she's got to go and what she needs to do. But if they can drive that through, I think that will take the principal driver of votes to reform. And I think to stand a chance of winning the next election, for me, what they've got to do is they've got to drive down reform to the early 20s in terms of vote, opinion polling. And they've got to hope that the Tories drift up a bit to the early 20s so that they're a kind of, I think Kemi is doing better, so I think that's plausible. And then you hope, right, well, now these two are fighting it out. Are they going to have an electoral pat? Are they not going to have an electoral pat? And the public goes into the election thinking, oh, that's just too confusing. I don't even know who vote for. I'll stick with what I I know. So there's like massive leaps to get over there, to get there. But to me, the biggest driver to reform is immigration, and they must do something about the economy too, obviously, and that will tell as we approach the election whether the economy is in a reasonable place. And we have, we've talked before about the kind of nuclear option, if you like, which is to have an election that's all about going back into Europe. But before we get to that, they've got to see reform drifting down and themselves drifting up a bit.
All right, so this is what I have been thinking a lot about, and actually, weirdly, I think these local and national elections could be way more significant for Reform, Farage, Badenoch, the Tories than for Starmer. And because if at the end of it, and I think this is quite likely, if at the end of it, donors to the Tory party see that actually one of two scenarios, right? Either the right is just split, but split in a way that means there's no possibility of either Reform or the Tories winning an election, or more likely, right, that Reform's position as the most likely party of the right to be able to form a government. I think money will talk, and what I mean by that is these are two parties that are wholly dependent on gifts from wealthy right-wingers. And I just think there is a very good chance that those wealthy right-wingers will basically say to the parties, we don't want two right-wing parties, we want a single right-wing party. And there are already donors who are contributing to both. And I just, and I would, I think there is a whether it happens immediately after local elections or whether we just begin to see signs of that pressure being put on them. It may not happen this year, but I think there is a very reasonable chance that pressure from donors will force a merger of Reform and the Conservative Party. Maybe, trying to think, it's the Reformed Conservative Party with something like that, and with Farage leading it, because what they all see basically in Reform is a talented, charismatic leader, but they have tremendous doubts, frankly, about, even though they're trying to become more respectable and become sort of more mainstream in some of their and small c conservative in some of their policies, and abandoning some of their sort of wilder economic plans. Nonetheless, the sort of conventional people, more conventional people on the right, some who are very, very wealthy, do have doubts about their ability to run the country. But they don't. But they do also think that the Tories still have more credit. So if you force them together, you solve a problem.
Do you agree that Kemi's getting a bit better?
Yeah, she's definitely getting better. But I mean,
from a low base.
But what she repeatedly says, which is true, right? Which is actually almost however much better she gets, and I think there is a lot in this, she is really going to struggle to turn this party around in any fundamental way, because the anger of British people with, the governments of Johnson and Truss, and just the chaos of particularly the latter part of the Tory years is so deep. I
think that's true, but I mean, listen, if we were giving them marks out of 10, I'd give Keir Starmer 4 out of 10 for this year. I think whatever you think about government, and I don't think he gets a very high mark for government, he gets 2 for politics. His political instincts are so wonky, it's hard to make sense of how on earth he got to where he is, and he's got to improve on that. And I think Kemi, maybe I would have given her 4 2 months ago, but I'd probably drifted up to a 6 now. I feel if the Tories hold their nerve, I mean, what she doesn't do, and we've talked about this before, is in a really disciplined way talk about only one thing. Because let's face it, she's only going to get one message through to the electorate over the next 2 years, and that's hopeful. And if that message is, we cannot live in a high tax, low growth economy anymore. You know, we have to concentrate on the cost of living and making the economy better for lots of lower to middle earners. If she, you know, and small companies and all that stuff, if she just espouses a very clear, very disciplined Tory pocketbook, home economics message, there's a chance that she breaks through and people start to think, do you know what, we really need to tilt back in. I mean, that's my feeling about it. If I was her advisor, I'd say hold your nerve. You didn't get.
Yeah, but she's got no choice. Of course, she's got to hold her nerve, and obviously she's doing better. But I'm just saying, I don't think it. Look, when voters have just decided they're sick to death of you, ask Labour.
Don't you think things move quicker than they used to?
Yeah,
I don't think you have to be 10 years in the wilderness anymore.
No, but I mean, genuinely, you believe? Look, they're on.
But look at Trump in the wilderness and then back in again.
But it was never on 16, 17%. His bedrock of support was always way over double that, right?
Yeah.
Always,
yeah.
Right? I'm not saying that she's doing a bad job. I'm just saying that when you've inherited so much negative sentiment towards your party, as she inherited. But finally, the other thing, though, that I would say, weirdly, it's quite similar to your prescription for the Tories, right? The single, and there's no point going over this again in detail, but the single biggest astonishing strategic mistake that Starmer has made over the last more than now 2 years, right, is to say his number one priority is growth, and then to do just a ton of other stuff that undermines growth, right? And I'm not saying they've done nothing that helps the growth agenda, but if you inherit the kind of Britain that he has inherited, as I say, with a collapse of hope, he should have made what he claimed was his priority actually the priority by basically vetoing absolutely anything that did not encourage growth or indeed damage growth, and just telling every single member of his team, I will reward you for everything that you do in that space. And the lack of that ability to focus, right, has done them incredible damage. Now, if they can achieve some of that focus in the new year, then maybe their reputation will recover a bit. We'll see.
Okay, that's it for now. And indeed, for this year, we'll be back in January to tackle whatever 2026 does have in store for us. If you've been with us for some of this year, all of this year, we thank you very, very much for investing your time with us. It's been a pleasure to do this podcast. We hope it's been a pleasure to listen or watch or whatever you were doing. But that's it. Have a lovely Christmas and New Year. Thanks for joining us. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.